Well, folks, pull up a chair. I want to talk to you about something that happened this week that should make every American, regardless of politics, regardless of party, stop and think about what kind of country we're becoming, about what happens when the most powerful office in the land starts threatening execution for people who remind soldiers they have to follow the law, about what it means when military veterans, people who've actually worn the uniform, have to stand up and explain basic principles of military justice because the commander-in-chief doesn't understand them or doesn't care. Donald Trump posted on Truth Social this week that certain behavior is seditious and punishable by death, not in some abstract hypothetical, not in reference to foreign enemies. He was talking about 6 Democratic lawmakers, 6 members of Congress who happen to be military veterans or former CIA officers, people who've served their country, who understand what oaths mean, who know what duty to the Constitution requires. And what was their crime? What did they do that Trump believes warrants execution? They released a video, a simple video reminding military service members that they have a legal obligation to disobey unlawful orders. That's it. That's what Trump considers sedition worthy of death. Telling soldiers that if they're ordered to do something illegal, they must refuse. Let me say that again because it's important. The President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, believes that reminding the military they must disobey illegal orders is punishable by death. That telling service members to follow the Uniform Code of Military Justice is sedition. That explaining basic legal obligations soldiers have under their oaths is treason. Think about what that means. Think about what it says about how Trump views military service, how he understands the chain of command, how he conceives of presidential power. He doesn't want soldiers who follow the law. He wants soldiers who follow him. Doesn't want service members who think critically about orders. He wants blind obedience. Doesn't want a military constrained by law. He wants a military that does whatever he says without question. That's not the American military. That's not what our service members sign up for. That's not what their oath means. And it's certainly not what the Uniform Code of Military Justice requires. But Trump doesn't care about any of that. He cares about loyalty, personal loyalty, to him, not to the Constitution, not to law, to him. And when 6 members of Congress reminded soldiers that law matters, that oaths mean something, that illegal orders must be refused, Trump's response was to threaten them with execution, to call their actions seditious, to suggest they should be hanged for doing their constitutional duty. Now, what's remarkable about this moment is who's pushing back, not just politicians, not just partisan critics, but military veterans, people who've served, who understand what it means to wear the uniform, who know what following orders means and what refusing illegal orders means, people whose credibility on military matters Trump can't dismiss as easily as he dismisses civilian critics. Schuyler Early, an Army veteran and advocate, put it simply, Trump screaming sedition because Democratic veterans made a message that the military can disobey unlawful orders, conveying the Uniform Code of Military Justice, is not sedition. January 6th was sedition, and Trump pardoned them all. That's the core of it. That's what Trump doesn't want people to remember, that he incited an attack on the Capitol, that he sent a mob to stop the peaceful transfer of power, that people died, that police officers were injured, that the democratic process was disrupted. That's sedition, actual sedition. And he pardoned everyone involved, gave them all a pass, treated attacking democracy as something worthy of forgiveness rather than punishment. But telling soldiers they must disobey illegal orders, that's what Trump calls sedition. That's what he believes deserves death. The inversion is complete. The people defending the Constitution are traitors. The people attacking it are patriots. Truth is sedition. Lies are loyalty. Following law is treason. Following Trump is duty. Pete Buttigieg, former Navy intelligence officer, explained what he was taught as a military officer, that you obey all lawful orders, that the emphasis on lawful is not small, that if you're ever ordered to do anything unlawful, your responsibility is to the law and to the Constitution. That's standard military training. That's what every officer learns. That's what the oath requires. Lawful orders, not all orders, not whatever the president says. Lawful orders. Orders that comply with law, with the Constitution, with the laws of armed conflict, with basic principles of military justice. And Buttigieg went further, explained what we've always assumed, that if a president ordered something blatantly illegal or unconstitutional, that order wouldn't get far, wouldn't reach the soldier or sailor or airman or Marine in the field, because senior military leadership, generals whose job is to be completely non-political, wouldn't allow it, would stop it, would refuse to pass along orders they knew violated law. But then he noted something crucial, something that should alarm everyone. One of the first things Trump did in his second term was change senior military leadership. Change the JAG Corps, the lawyers who advise generals and admirals on what's lawful. Remove the people who might say no. Replace them with people more willing to comply with political pressure. That creates uncertainty down the chain of command. Creates pressure on service members who are worried about whether everything they're being ordered to do is lawful and constitutional. Removes the institutional safeguards we've relied on to prevent illegal orders from being carried out. And that's deliberate. That's not accidental. That's Trump systematically removing the people who might constrain him, who might say no, who might remind him that law applies even to presidents. He's replacing them with loyalists, with people who owe their positions to him, with people who might be less willing to refuse illegal orders because they fear losing the positions he gave them. That's dangerous. That's how illegal orders stop being theoretical and start being real. That's how you get from "the system would prevent that" to "nobody stopped it." That's how democracies slide into authoritarianism, not through dramatic coups, but through steady replacement of people who might resist with people who won't. Now, let me talk about Mo Davis, retired Air Force commander, former military judge, someone who spent his career in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the legal arm of the military, someone who knows military law better than almost anyone. His response to Trump's threats is worth paying attention to, because he puts this in historical context, makes clear what's at stake, explains why this matters beyond immediate politics. Davis starts by talking about Auschwitz, about the Holocaust, about Rudolf Höss, who commanded the camp where more than 1 million people were murdered, about Höss's defense at Nuremberg, his claim that he was just following orders, that he never thought to disobey, that someone else would have done it if he hadn't, that he never really considered whether it was wrong. That defense didn't work. The Nuremberg trials established a principle that's guided military law ever since. Following orders is not a defense for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, for violations of basic legal and moral principles. Soldiers have an obligation to refuse illegal orders, can't hide behind claims they were just doing what they were told. That principle exists for a reason. Exists because we learned, at terrible cost, what happens when soldiers follow illegal orders without question, when obedience becomes more important than law, when duty to superiors overrides duty to humanity. We learned that leads to atrocities, to horrors, to the kind of crimes that make civilization impossible. So we established clearly, firmly, that soldiers must refuse illegal orders, must think about what they're being asked to do, must say no when ordered to commit crimes. That's not optional. That's not subject to presidential whim. That's a fundamental principle of military justice, a lesson bought with millions of lives, a safeguard we put in place to prevent those horrors from happening again. And now 6 Democratic members of Congress, all veterans or former intelligence officers, reminded service members of that principle, posted a video explaining that they have a legal obligation to disobey unlawful orders, that if ordered to attack American civilians or murder fishermen off the coast of Venezuela, they have a duty to refuse. That's not controversial. That's not sedition. That's basic military law. The same principle established at Nuremberg, the same obligation taught at every military academy, the same requirement embedded in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. These lawmakers weren't saying anything new, weren't making political statements. We're simply reminding people of established law. And Trump's response? Stephen Miller said they were inciting insurrection. Trump himself called it seditious behavior warranting execution. The President of the United States said members of Congress should be killed for explaining military law, for reminding soldiers of their legal obligations, for doing exactly what their oaths require them to do. Davis notes the irony. Republicans always complain that Democrats are inciting violence. But here they are, holding up members of Congress for telling the truth and saying they should be murdered for doing it. The projection is complete. The party that claims to care about law and order is threatening execution for people who remind soldiers to follow law. Then Davis gets personal, talks about serving in the JAG Corps alongside Roger Wicker and Lindsey Graham, senators who are lawyers themselves, who know military law, who understand that what those Democratic lawmakers said is correct, who know that reminding soldiers they must refuse illegal orders is not just acceptable, it's necessary. But Wicker and Graham aren't standing up for the Democratic lawmakers, aren't defending the principle, aren't saying that threatening execution for explaining military law crosses every line, because they've made a decision that it's in their interest to go along, to stay silent, to let Trump threaten members of Congress without consequence. Davis is blunt about this, says some people are just stupid and fall for Trump's lies. But Wicker and Graham know better. They're lawyers, they're veterans, they understand military law, they know Trump is wrong, but they've chosen partisan loyalty over principle, political expediency over constitutional duty, staying in Trump's good graces over defending colleagues who are being threatened with death. That choice matters, because when people who know better stay silent, when lawyers who understand the law refuse to speak up, when veterans who took the same oath abdicate their responsibility, it enables Trump to go further, makes his threats seem acceptable, normalizes behavior that should be universally condemned, teaches him there are no consequences for threatening execution of members of Congress. And Davis doesn't stop there. Says if the president calling for execution of members of Congress for telling the truth isn't grounds for impeachment, then what is? If threatening to kill lawmakers for reminding soldiers to follow law doesn't warrant removal, what does? Where's the line? What would Trump have to do to make Republicans say enough? Those are good questions, questions that should haunt every Republican in Congress. Every senator who's staying silent, every representative who's refusing to condemn this. Because if threatening execution isn't enough, if calling for hangings doesn't cross the line, what does? Where's the boundary? What's the principle that matters enough to defend even when it's politically costly? I've been watching American politics for more than 80 years. I've seen presidents overstep, seen partisan fights get ugly, seen constitutional boundaries tested, but I've never seen a president threaten to execute members of Congress for explaining law to the military. Never seen that treated as acceptable by a major political party. Never seen silence in response to threats that should provoke universal condemnation. That silence is more dangerous than Trump's threats, because Trump's been threatening people his entire political career, been calling for violence against opponents, been suggesting his critics deserve punishment. That's who he is. That's what he does. We know that about him. But the silence from Republicans who know better, that's what enables it. That's what makes it sustainable. That's what teaches Trump he can keep going further without consequences. If Graham and Wicker, who served in the JAG Corps, who know military law, who understand why what those Democratic lawmakers said is correct, if they won't speak up, who will? Let me talk about what this means for service members. For the men and women in uniform who are caught between their oath to the Constitution and pressure from their commander-in-chief. For the soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who are trying to figure out how to do their duty when duty seems to point in different directions. Their oath is clear. They swear to support and defend the Constitution. Not the president, not any individual. The Constitution, the document, the principles, the system of law. That's what the oath means. That's what military service is supposed to be about. Defending constitutional principles, not following orders without question. And the Uniform Code of Military Justice is equally clear. Lawful orders must be obeyed. Unlawful orders must be refused. That distinction between lawful and unlawful is fundamental, is what separates a professional military from a tool of tyranny, is what prevents the kind of atrocities the Nuremberg trials were convened to address. But Trump is creating pressure to ignore that distinction, replacing military leadership with loyalists, changing JAG officers, creating an environment where questioning orders seems risky, where raising concerns about legality might cost your career, where following your oath to the Constitution might get you in more trouble than following illegal orders. That puts service members in an impossible position. Follow illegal orders and risk prosecution later. Refuse illegal orders and face immediate consequences now. Either way, you're at risk. Either way, your career might be destroyed. Either way, you're being forced to choose between competing pressures when the law should make the choice clear. That's why those 6 Democratic lawmakers made their video. Why they reminded service members of their legal obligations. Why they explained that refusing illegal orders isn't just permitted, it's required. They were trying to give service members cover, trying to remind them that the law is on their side when they refuse illegal orders, trying to make clear that following the Constitution is what their oath requires, even when it's difficult. And Trump's response was to threaten them with death, to call their reminder sedition, to suggest they should be hanged for doing exactly what their own oaths required them to do. That's not just wrong. That's actively dangerous. That's telling service members that following the law might get them killed, that the people trying to help them understand their legal obligations are enemies, that loyalty to Trump matters more than loyalty to the Constitution. I want to talk about the economic implications of all this, because people think military policy is separate from economic policy. Think that what happens in the Pentagon doesn't affect what happens on Wall Street. But it does. Indirectly, through confidence, through stability, through the belief that American institutions function properly. When the military becomes politicized, when legal safeguards get removed, when service members are pressured to follow illegal orders, when the commander-in-chief threatens execution for anyone who reminds soldiers they must follow law, that creates instability. Not military instability necessarily, but institutional instability, political instability, the kind of instability that makes investors nervous. Markets run on predictability, on the belief that systems work, that institutions function, that power is constrained by law. When the military stops being a professional, non-political institution constrained by legal principles and becomes a tool of presidential will unconstrained by law, that's a fundamental change in American governance. That's the kind of change that makes investors question whether America is still the safe, stable, predictable place they thought it was. I've spent 80 years betting on American institutions, betting they're strong enough to constrain power, stable enough to trust with long-term capital, resilient enough to survive stress and emerge stronger. And most of the time, that bet has paid off, has been justified by reality, has proven correct even when tested. But we're testing it hard now. Testing whether the military can remain non-political when the commander-in-chief demands personal loyalty. Testing whether legal safeguards can survive when the people who enforce them get replaced by loyalists. Testing whether service members will refuse illegal orders when refusing might cost them everything. Testing whether America is still a country where law constrains power, or whether we're becoming something else. Those tests have economic consequences, not immediate, not in tomorrow's stock prices, but in how investors think about risk, how they price long-term stability, how confident they are that American institutions will still function the same way in 5 years or 10 years. When those questions become uncertain, when answers aren't obvious, when institutions look fragile, capital becomes cautious. Returns have to be higher to compensate for increased risk. Investment horizons shorten. Commitment to American assets decreases. That's expensive. Not dramatically, not in ways that make headlines, but cumulatively, over time, in the slow erosion of the advantages America has always had, the stability, the predictability, the trustworthiness. The premium investors have always been willing to pay for the safety of American institutions. When the commander-in-chief threatens to execute members of Congress for reminding soldiers to follow law, when senior military leadership gets purged and replaced with loyalists, when JAG officers who might say no get removed, when the institutional safeguards we've relied on to prevent illegal orders start disappearing, that premium shrinks, that advantage erodes, that trust diminishes, and rebuilding it takes decades, takes generations. Because once investors lose confidence in institutional stability, getting it back requires proof. sustained proof, years of evidence that the problems were fixed, that institutions recovered, that the testing didn't break anything permanently. You can't just announce that everything's fine and expect capital to believe you. You have to demonstrate it, over and over, until trust is restored. That's what's at stake economically. Not just the immediate fallout from whatever illegal orders might be given, but the long-term cost of institutional degradation, the premium America pays in terms of higher borrowing costs and reduced investment when the world stops, seeing us as uniquely stable, when the military stops being seen as a professional, non-political institution and starts being seen as a political tool, when power stops being constrained by law and starts being constrained only by what the powerful can get away with. Now, let me come back to Mo Davis's point about impeachment, because he's right. If threatening to execute members of Congress for telling the truth isn't grounds for impeachment, what is? If calling for hangings doesn't cross the line, where is the line? What would Trump have to do to make Republicans say this is too far, we can't defend this, constitutional duty requires us to act? I don't know the answer to that question, because I've watched Republicans defend things I never thought anyone would defend. Watched them excuse behavior I thought was inexcusable. Watched them stay silent about threats I thought would provoke universal condemnation. Watched them abandon principles I thought were non-negotiable. Watched them choose party over country, loyalty over law, expediency over duty. So I genuinely don't know what the line is. Don't know what Trump would have to do to make Republicans act. Don't know if there even is a line anymore or whether party loyalty has completely overridden every other consideration. But the question matters. Matters for democracy, matters for rule of law, matters for whether the constitutional system of checks and balances still functions. Because impeachment is supposed to be the mechanism for removing presidents who abuse power, who violate their oaths, who become threats to the constitutional order. If threatening to execute members of Congress doesn't qualify, if removing legal safeguards in the military doesn't qualify, if systematically defying court orders doesn't qualify, if claiming unlimited power doesn't qualify, then what does impeachment exist for? What's its purpose? What kind of conduct would actually trigger it? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They're practical ones. They determine whether one of the key constitutional mechanisms for constraining presidential power still works or whether it's become completely dysfunctional. Whether it can still protect democracy or whether it's just another political tool that only gets used against presidents from the other party. The answer matters economically because impeachment is part of the system of checks and balances that makes American governance stable. That constrains power. That prevents any one person from becoming too powerful. If it stops working, if it becomes impossible to remove presidents who abuse power, that's a fundamental change in how the system operates. That's the kind of structural shift that affects everything else. Markets price in the belief that American institutions work, that checks and balances exist, that power is constrained. If impeachment stops functioning as a check, if presidents can do anything without fear of removal as long as their party controls enough Senate seats, that changes the calculation, changes the risk, changes how investors think about American stability. Let me talk about the veterans who are speaking out, about what their voices mean, about why it matters that people who've served, who've worn the uniform, who understand military culture from the inside, are the ones pushing back most forcefully against Trump's threats. Skyler Early, Army veteran. Pete Buttigieg, Navy intelligence officer. Mo Davis, Air Force commander and military judge. These aren't partisan operatives. These aren't people who've never served criticizing from the outside. These are people who know what they're talking about, who've lived it, who've taken the same oaths service members take, who understand military law because they've operated under it. When they say the Democratic lawmakers were right, when they explain that reminding soldiers they must refuse illegal orders is correct, when they push back against Trump's claims of sedition, they're not making partisan arguments. They're explaining military law. They're defending principles embedded in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They're standing up for the same oaths they took when they served. That credibility matters because it's harder to dismiss veterans as partisan hacks, harder to claim they don't understand military culture, Harder to suggest they're putting politics above country when they're the ones who've actually served. Their voices carry weight that civilian voices, no matter how correct, can't match. And they're using that weight, using their credibility, using their platforms, using their understanding of military law to push back, to defend the democratic lawmakers, to explain to service members why refusing illegal orders is required, to make clear that following the Constitution is what the oath means. That's courage. That's accepting personal risk to defend principle. That's knowing Trump might target them next, might call them seditious, might threaten them with execution, and speaking up anyway because some things are more important than personal safety. Some principles are worth defending even when it's dangerous, and their message is getting through. The video clips are going viral. The explanations are being shared. Service members are seeing people they respect, veterans they trust, explaining that the Democratic lawmakers were right, that refusing illegal orders is legal, that following the Constitution is duty, that Trump's threats are wrong. That matters. That creates space for service members to follow their oaths. That gives them cover to refuse illegal orders. That reminds them they're not alone, that there are people who've worn the uniform who will support them if they do the right thing. That courage is possible. That duty to the Constitution is real. Now, Trump's threats aren't just directed at the 6 Democratic lawmakers. They're directed at anyone who might refuse illegal orders. Anyone who might remind service members they have legal obligations. Anyone who might stand between Trump and the unlimited power he thinks he deserves. The threats are meant to intimidate, to silence, to make people afraid to speak up, to create an environment where questioning orders seems too risky, where following the law seems more dangerous than violating it, where the safest choice is blind obedience. But the veterans pushing back are showing that intimidation doesn't have to work, that speaking up is possible, that defending principles is worth the risk, that courage exists, that not everyone will be silenced. That's important, not just for the immediate situation, but for establishing that resistance is possible, that Trump's threats don't have to be accepted, that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed and people willing to defend those lines, that democracy doesn't have to collapse just because one person wants unlimited power. Every time someone speaks up despite the risk, they make it easier for the next person. Every time a veteran explains military law despite Trump's threats, they encourage service members to follow that law. Every time someone with credibility defends the principle that illegal orders must be refused, they strengthen that principle. That's how institutions survive. Not through dramatic gestures, but through steady, consistent defense of principles by people willing to accept personal cost to do what's right. Through veterans using their credibility to protect service members from pressure. Through judges ruling orders illegal despite presidential anger. Through members of Congress standing firm despite threats of execution. All of it adds up. All of it matters. All of it contributes to whether the system survives intact or collapses under pressure. And right now, at this moment, with Trump threatening execution and replacing military leadership and removing legal safeguards, every voice that speaks up matters. Every veteran who explains military law matters. Every defense of constitutional principle matters. Because we're at a crossroads, a point where the choices people make now will determine what kind of country we become. Whether we remain a democracy where law constrains power, or whether we become something else, something where presidential will is law, where soldiers follow orders without question, where threatening execution for disagreement is normal, where constitutional principles are optional. I don't know which path we'll take. Don't know if enough people will speak up. Don't know if institutions will prove strong enough. Don't know if the veterans pushing back will be heard widely enough to make a difference. Don't know if service members will have the courage to refuse illegal orders when the pressure to comply is intense. But I know what I hope for. Hope that the veterans speaking out inspire others. Hope that their explanations of military law reach service members who need to hear them. Hope that their defense of constitutional principles reminds people what's at stake. Hope that their courage becomes contagious. Because that's what democracy needs right now. Not perfection, not dramatic victories, just steady, persistent defense of principles by people willing to pay the cost, veterans willing to speak up, judges willing to rule against illegal orders, members of Congress willing to stand firm despite threats, service members willing to refuse illegal orders, citizens willing to demand accountability. All of it together, all of it consistently, all of it despite the risk. That's how institutions survive. That's how democracy persists. That's how we become the country we claim to be rather than the country Trump wants us to be. And economically, that persistence is what justifies continued investment in America, what maintains the premium investors pay for stability, what keeps capital flowing here, what preserves the advantages we've always had. Because markets don't just bet on GDP or corporate earnings, they bet on systems, on institutions, on the belief that America works. When veterans defend military law despite threats, when they explain that refusing illegal orders is required, when they push back against unlimited presidential power, they're not just defending democracy. They're defending the institutional stability that makes American capitalism possible. They're protecting the foundation everything else sits on. That protection matters. Economically, politically, morally. For everyone who depends on a system that works, on rules that apply, on power that's constrained, on a country where law matters more than loyalty to any individual. That's what's at stake. That's what the veterans speaking out are defending. That's what Trump's threatening. That's what we need to protect, not just for now, but for the future, for the America we want to pass to the next generation, for the country we claim to be, and I believe we'll protect it. Believe the veterans speaking out will be heard. Believe service members will refuse illegal orders. Believe institutions will hold. Believe democracy will survive. Because the alternative is unthinkable. And Americans, when pushed to the edge, tend to choose the right path, eventually, after trying everything else, but eventually. That's my bet. The same bet I've been making for 80 years. That America works, that institutions hold, that law matters, that the system survives. It's been tested before. It's being tested now. And I believe it will pass the test. Not easily, not without cost, but it will pass. Because the veterans are speaking up, because judges are ruling, because some members of Congress are standing firm, because somewhere service members are preparing to refuse illegal orders, because courage still exists, because principles still matter, because America is still worth defending. That's what gives me hope. Not certainty, but hope. And hope, combined with action, has always been enough, has always been what carries us through, has always been what makes tomorrow possible. So I'm hopeful, despite everything, despite the threats, despite the institutional decay, despite the silence from people who should speak up, despite all of it. I'm hopeful because the veterans are speaking and their voices matter and the truth they're telling is getting heard. And that's how it starts. That's how institutions recover. That's how democracy survives. One voice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one defense of principle at a time, until enough people stand up that standing up becomes normal again, until defending the Constitution stops being risky and becomes expected, until following the law is praised rather than punished. We're not there yet, but we're fighting to get there. And the veterans leading that fight, they're showing us the way, reminding us what duty means, what oaths require, what courage looks like. And if we follow their example, if we find our own courage, if we defend our own principles, we'll get there. Eventually. After the struggle, after the testing, after proving we mean what we say about democracy and law and constitutional government, we'll get there. And America will survive. And the bet I've been making for 80 years will pay off again, as it always has, as I believe it always will.